Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Ms. LaViolette, you are still under oath. Do you understand?
Yes, I do.
Mr. Martinez, you may continue.
Ma'am, yesterday we finished off and we were talking about the Reagan-Housley instant message that you reviewed. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And in it, Mr. Alexander expressed that he was extremely fearful of the defendant because of her stalking behavior, correct?
He didn't say it was extremely fearful. No, he didn't.
Judge, I think we need to approach now. You read the Reagan-Housley instant message, correct?
Yes, I did.
And there's an indication to the reader that Mr. Alexander was extremely afraid because of the stalking conduct by Jodi Arias, correct?
I don't see any behavior supporting his fear, Mr. Martinez. I see no behavior supporting that fear. And they were both laughing in the email as well.
You can tell, first of all, whether somebody is laughing on the other side of a text or of an instant message, ma'am? You can tell that?
There was just ha, ha, ha.
Not at that time, was there?
Right before that, as they were talking
Not
about
at that time when he said that, correct?
No.
Judge, may I ask the question that we've been talking about?
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask that you go back to the jury room for approximately 5 minutes. No more than 5 minutes. Please remember the admonition.
Please back to the jury.
We are at recess for 3 minutes. Ms. LaViolette, you may step down. Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Mr. Martinez, you may continue.
Ma'am, you reviewed the Reagan-Housley instant message involving her and Mr. Alexander, correct?
Correct.
Isn't it true that Mr. Alexander was extremely afraid of the defendant, Jodi Arias, based on her stalking behavior?
He said,
No, please don't tell me what he said. Just answer my question.
he was afraid of her, yes.
Because of her stalking behavior, correct?
Correct.
And ma'am, if we take a look at this exhibit 614, if we're talking about aggression and abuse, if Mr. Alexander is afraid of the defendant, extremely afraid of the defendant because of her stalking behavior, then we've moved over to this column here that talks about stalking, correct?
You're mischaracterizing my continuum, Mr. Martinez.
I'm not asking you to tell me about the continuum. Isn't it true that stalking is mentioned under terrorism in your continuum of aggression and abuse? Yes or no?
Stalking, that is...
Yes or no?
It's not yes or no, Mr. Martinez.
Do you see these letters here?
It's not a yes or no answer,
Ma'am,
Mr. Martinez.
I'm asking you. Do you see this word here that I'm pointing to? Yes or
I
no?
see that word.
Is that word stalking? Yes or no?
That word
Yes or
has
no?
a definition,
I'm
and
not
you're
asking
not
you.
using it. You're not using the definition that I apply in this continuum. So if you want me to talk about what stalking means,
Judge,
I will
not-
talk about it.
Not responsive.
Sustained. Next question.
Ma'am, that issue involving stalking does appear on the right-hand side of this diagram, correct?
It appears on all three, as I think. Usually it's at the bottom of the other two as well.
Well, let's take a look at the other two. You put this together, right?
Well, it was left
Yeah,
off.
no, ma'am. Did you put this together?
This one,
Yes.
this is one that was copied
Ma'am.
from somebody. This is not my complete continuum, Mr. Martinez.
Well, ma'am, let's go back to the one that you adopted then, all right? Take a look at Exhibit 558. And you say that stalking appears elsewhere. Let's take a look under battering, even though we can't read that real well. Do you see stalking anywhere underneath that column? Yes or no?
No, I don't. I discuss it.
Ma'am, then with regard to the column, you see that? It says abuse. Do you see any stalking underneath there?
Mr. Martinez.
Yes or no?
Mr. Martinez.
Yes or no?
I discuss
Yes or no?
stalking in
Yes.
both of those areas.
Judge, non-responsive.
Sustained.
Yes or no? Do you see stalking under abuse?
I don't believe that's a yes or no answer, Mr. Martinez.
I'm not asking you
I
what
know,
you
but
believe.
do you want the truth of this, or
Yes,
do you want?
I want you to answer the truthfully and take a
I
look.
can't answer it truthfully with yes or no. That's what I'm saying to you. I would like to be able to answer it truthfully.
Ma'am, what is this word up here?
Abuse,
What is this phrase underneath there?
sporadic physical aggression,
And the phrase underneath that is what?
name calling but not character assassination,
And underneath that is what?
verbal abuse but not psychological abuse,
And underneath that is what?
may be remorseful,
And underneath that, what does that read?
threats of abandonment,
And underneath that,
aggression takes place without witnesses.
anywhere there, do you see the word stalking? Yes or no?
I do not see the word stalking.
We go over to the left under high conflict. Do you see the word stalking anywhere there?
High conflict is not domestic violence, Mr. Martinez.
I'm not asking you what high conflict is, am I, ma'am?
That is not an area where you would see stalking, Mr.
Ma'am.
Martinez.
Let's just take a look at this then. You see this word here? What is
High
that word?
conflict
Underneath that, read that for me.
does not solve problems well.
Underneath that?
Anger is an issue in family. Stalking was never
Ma'am,
listed
ma'am,
there.
I'm not asking you that. What is this right here?
May have remorse.
And underneath that?
May have sporadic physical aggression and or destruction of property.
And
Can have
underneath?
emotional abuse. No fear. Balance of power and relationship.
Do you see the word stalking there?
It was never there.
The answer is no then, correct?
Correct.
Then if we go over to battering. You see that?
Yes, I do.
What's the first concept there?
Monopolization of perception.
Underneath that?
Generally, more regular physical abuse may not occur without, but may occur without physical.
Underneath that?
Threats to victim support system. Jealousy. Putting down family and friends. Destruction of property. Self-absorbed. Sexual abuse. Change in victim's personality, more generally violent.
Do you see the word stalking anywhere in that column? Yes or no?
No.
The only place that the word stalking appears is under the column terrorism, correct?
Correct, and I define it.
And ma'am, one of the things that you told us about the term stalking yesterday was that terrorism, or not terrorism, but stalking involves a frightened response on behalf of the person who's being stalked. Do you remember telling us that?
A frightened behavior.
Pardon?
Frightened behaviors.
Did you use the word frightened in regard to defining the term stalking?
I used frightened, but it needs to be demonstrated in the behavior of the person. People who are stalked generally take action about being stalked, Mr. Martinez, and I saw no action taken.
What you are saying is that you are, even though you indicated at the start of this exchange that in that Reagan-Housley instant message, you indicated that, yes, you saw that Mr. Alexander, and the term that was used was extremely afraid because of the stalking behavior by the defendant. You're now backing away from that then. You're saying that when you agreed to that, you didn't mean to agree to it. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying...
Yes or no? Yes or no?
It is not a yes or no question.
Well, extremely afraid. Mr. Alexander was extremely afraid. Did you not agree with that assessment just minutes ago?
I agreed with his verbiage.
No. Judge, may we approach?
You may.
take a look at Exhibit 615, read the first page. And once you're done reading the first page, let me know.
Sure.
Have you read it?
Yes, I have.
I have it back. And isn't it true that the verbiage indicates that Mr. Alexander was extremely afraid of the defendant, Jodi Arias, because of her stalking behavior?
Yes, the verbiage supports that.
And you don't know whether or not he was telling the truth, do you?
No, I don't.
So it could just as well be that he was telling the truth or not, correct?
I would have,
Speculation.
Correct?
I look at the big picture.
No, I'm not asking about the big picture. I'm just asking about this.
If I look specifically at
Judge, may
that
we-
email,
may we
then
approach?
yes.
Interjection.
And so then, if Mr. Alexander was extremely afraid because of the stalking behavior of the defendant, I want to talk to you about what may have happened in the relationship previously. For example, you are aware that they had a relationship from when to when. What is your understanding?
Their official relationship or
The
their actual
official
relationship?
relationship, yes.
The official relationship started in February of 2007 and officially ended in June or July of 07.
And ma'am, at the time that this relationship ended in June or July of 2007, isn't it true that at the time that it ended, the defendant was living in California and Mr. Alexander was living in Arizona, correct?
Correct.
And after the relationship ended, isn't it true that the defendant moved from California to Mesa, Arizona, to a neighborhood near Mr. Alexander, correct?
I don't know the neighborhood, but yes, she moved to Mesa.
We have had testimony from the defendant that she moved to a neighborhood that was near the defendant. Would you have any knowledge of anything in your documentation that would indicate anything to the contrary?
No.
And if we take this idea that Mr. Alexander has this fear of the defendant because of her stalking behavior, if they broke up, wouldn't that be an indicator of a stalking, or at least the beginning of a stalking behavior, when the parties break up and then the defendant moves to Mesa, Arizona? Wouldn't that be at least an indication or a starting point for this stalking behavior?
No.
No? Okay. So you see that as appropriate that after the breakup and after the fact that they're in two separate states, that she moves to Arizona, you see no problem with it from a stalking perspective, correct?
I see no end to the relationship in any communication between Mr. Alexander and Miss Arias that discourages her from moving, nor that acts like the relationship is over. And in fact,
I'm over here.
it's over verbally, I suppose, but behaviorally, it never has ended.
And behaviorally, it hasn't ended because the person in the blue shirt over there moved over to Mesa, Arizona, correct?
No, not correct.
Well, immediately after that, if the relationship ended in June or July of 2007, didn't Mr. Alexander manifest an indication that he was done with the relationship in August of 2007?
No. In
Well,
fact,
is it yes or no?
No, it's not a yes or no.
Isn't it true that in August of 2007, the defendant went over to Mr. Alexander's house while he had a guest there? Do you remember that?
In August?
Of 2007, yes.
Yes.
And
Yes.
isn't it true that she was uninvited to come over when Mr. Alexander was there with that guest, correct?
Objection, speculation, knowledge, and mischaracterizes the testimony.
You may answer yes or no.
That it's a yes or no?
Yes.
She came over, they had a back and forth relationship.
I'm not
She
asking
had the password to his...
Objection, non-responsive.
Next question.
And ma'am, isn't it true that when she came over, she was outside of a glass type of, or in other words, she was on the outside looking in through glass as Mr. Alexander was in an intimate moment with another woman, correct?
She had tried to go through
Yes.
the garage
Yes
where she
or
had
no?
the password, and she couldn't get into the door, so went around and
Objection,
left.
non-responsive.
Sustained.
I'm asking you about how she saw what was going on inside. That's what I'm asking you about. Isn't it true that she stood outside looking in through glass as Mr. Alexander was inside with another woman involved in an intimate moment? Yes or no?
Yes, and she immediately left.
Ma'am, did I ask you whether or not she immediately left? Yes or no?
You're asking me very
No,
incomplete
I asked you
questions,
whether
Mr.
or not-
Martinez. You're asking me very incomplete questions that don't get at what my testimony is about, which is about...
Judge, objection, non-responsive.
I'm going to ask that you answer only the question you're being asked. Ms. Wilmot will have an opportunity to ask you some follow-up questions, and she can clarify anything at that point that you think should be clarified. Mr. Martinez, you may continue.
And when she came over unannounced, as far as you know, correct?
Correct.
Objection, mischaracterizes the testimony.
Overruled, you may answer.
And your answer was correct, right?
I actually don't know.
Well, ma'am-
As far as I know, she was not invited.
Ma'am, you said correct previously, right?
As far as I know, it's correct.
Ma'am, you didn't add as far as I know, did you? Previously.
No, I didn't.
And when she was there, ma'am, one of the things that the defendant was able to see through the light of the television that what Mr. Alexander was kissing this other woman, correct?
I believe so.
And isn't it true that the defendant was also able to see that at some point the brassiere was being hooked or unhooked at some point, correct?
Correct.
So she was there for a period of time to watch Mr. Alexander in an intimate moment with somebody else, right?
Objection, speculation, and foundation.
Overruled.
I don't know how long she was there, Mr. Martinez.
She was long enough to see what you just described, correct?
Correct.
And at that point, isn't there an indication, at least from Mr. Alexander's behavior, that he was done with the relationship because he had moved on to another woman, right?
No, that's not true.
So Mr. Alexander being with another woman is not an indication that he is done with the relationship with Miss Arias. Yes or no? The way you see it, yes or no?
It is not a yes or no. I cannot give that a yes or no.
And isn't that, though, an indication, again, if we're talking that Mr. Alexander was extremely frightened of the stalking behavior of the defendant, isn't that an indication of stalking behavior to go over to an ex-boyfriend's house and look inside the window while he's in an intimate moment with another woman? Yes or no?
No.
All right? And ma'am, one of the things that you told us was that you relied on these journals, right?
In part.
In part. And you took them to be true, correct?
I took them to be part of what I considered.
I'm not asking you what you consider. I'm asking about the content itself. Isn't it true that you took these journals to be true? Yes or no?
The journals in corroboration with the other information, Mr. Martinez.
So the answer is yes, you took them to be true because you say you did some corroborative work, correct?
I did a lot of corroborative work.
Right, and so what you're saying is you took them to be true based on your investigation, right?
I would need to know what part you mean that I took to be true.
All of the journals, you took those to be
I
true.
cannot tell you that I took in toto, and there would be a piece here and a piece here that I wouldn't question or wouldn't want to know. So you're asking me about pages and pages of journals. If you can be specific, I could answer that.
How about the one on August 26th of 2007? You took that entry to be true, didn't you?
Will you refresh me with that journal
Sure,
entry?
let's take a look at it. Does that refresh your recollection about what we're talking about?
Yes.
And in fact, this was written after the defendant had engaged in this behavior when she went over to Mr. Alexander's house unannounced and looked inside. You're aware of that, right?
Yes, I am.
Isn't that an indication of a stalking state of mind, given the fact that Mr. Alexander has indicated that he was extremely frightened because of the defendant's stalking behavior?
Objection, mischaracterizes the testimony with regard to when the IM was created.
Sustained.
Ma'am, in terms of the message, you know when it was written, don't you?
Excuse me?
You know when this was written, don't you?
The Reagan-Housley?
Yes.
That was written in '08, I believe.
Right. And do you know approximately when in '08 that it was written?
I'm not sure the date in '08, but it was written in '08.
And this is in August 26th of '07, right?
Correct.
So that this would be before this instant message, correct?
Correct.
And this was written the day after this, not peeping, but looking into the window took place, correct?
Correct.
Isn't that an indication of stalking behavior?
No.
And ma'am, you said that you looked at these entries and that you corroborated what was in them, right?
I looked at lots of entries. I
And-
didn't corroborate each and every entry. No, I didn't.
You looked at corroborative evidence is what you told me, right?
Correct.
Well, in this, and if you want to look at, I want you to look at all of it, isn't it true that it makes no mention there or anywhere else of the defendant going over to Mr. Alexander's house, looking inside the window and seeing him with another woman? It doesn't say anything about that, does it?
No, it doesn't.
And so that's an indication that these journals, whatever they may be, one thing is that they're not truthful, are they?
Objection, mischaracterizes the journals.
Overruled.
They're not complete.
And incomplete means being untruthful, doesn't it, in this context of this investigation, doesn't it?
It does not mean untruthful. It means incomplete.
Where does it say here in this entry of Sunday, August 26th of '07, that the defendant admits that she engaged in a stalking type behavior of going over to Mr. Alexander's home, looking inside through the window and seeing him with another woman? Does it?
Objection, mischaracterizes her testimony as to characterizing its stalking behavior.
Overruled.
Anywhere in there does it say that?
No.
So that would be that, what do you attribute that to? Because before you were telling us that these messages, or not these messages, but these journals, that they were influenced by this law of attraction, right?
Right?
Are you now telling us that because of the law of attraction she didn't write it in here? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying that at all.
And she didn't, the bottom line is she didn't write it here, correct?
She didn't write it there.
And we don't have a complete picture of what was going on if we start basing what we do on these journals, correct?
We need to be basing them and probably looking at the numerous other women he was with at the time he was with the woman on the couch, that there were other women, and that because he was with one woman didn't mean he had ended a relationship with another woman.
Ma'am, how many other women was Mr. Alexander with on this period of time in August of 2007? You keep saying other women. How many other women? Go ahead, give me a number.
Well, there was Lisa.
In August of 2007. You are absolutely certain he was with Lisa in August of 2000. I'm over here. You keep looking to your left. In August of
I'm going to look over here.
In August of 2007, ma'am. Are you
I
absolutely...
have a list of people he was with from December 2007. Some of them he was with before. There was a Nicole Broadbent who talked to him prior to that, who was talking to him in 2007. There was Jodi Arias, and there was someone else in 2007. Most of my data comes from December 2007 to June of 2008. And those are the emails I have.
And you indicated talking to some other woman, correct?
I indicated that he was at least communicating with Deanna at this time. He was communicating with Nicole at this time. He was communicating with Jodi Arias at this time, and he was communicating with Lisa at this time.
And in your standard, the standard that you are applying, in this case, if Mr. Alexander is talking to another woman, he's a bad guy, right? Because
no,
isn't that how you're portraying him in this case? That he's a bad guy because he's talking to all these other women, right?
No, not at all. Overall.
So he's a good guy then.
The prosecutor's tone.
Approach, please.
Just because he's talking to other women doesn't mean that he's doing anything with them, is he?
There's flirtation.
And you see, applying your standard, you see that as something bad on the part of Mr. Alexander, don't you?
You asked me bad
No.
or good, and I don't see the world in bad and good. Mr. Martinez, I see the world with lots of shades of gray, and so I'm not going to go bad and good with you. I can't do that.
Well,
there's gray in there.
one of the things that you told us, or you told me during the interview, was that you're old-fashioned, right?
That doesn't...
Yes or no? Yes or no?
Sure, I told you I was
And ma'am,
old-fashioned.
Is it somehow that you were offended from that point of view that Mr. Alexander, after he's broken up, or after they've broken up, by your standard, after they've broken up, are you somehow offended, and so that it impacted your view of the evidence just because Mr. Alexander, according to you, may be talking to other girls?
No, not at all. I
right.
have two older children.
I'm
I
gonna
have been
object
through
to
the
that
60s. I have been through the 70s.
Sustained.
Ma'am, you don't know whether or not Mr. Alexander was engaged in any sort of sexual behavior with Deanna during this time, do you?
No, I don't.
You don't know if he was involved with any sexual behavior involving Lisa Andrews, correct?
No, I don't.
And you believe that he was involved with Lisa Andrews in August of 2007, right?
He was involved with Lisa Andrews in the later part of 2007, and it may have been in October. It may not have been then. I don't know who this young woman on the couch was. I don't.
I'm not asking you about that. I'm asking you about Lisa Andrews, correct?
Lisa Andrews may not have been until later, but I'm not sure. It was an 8-month relationship. It ended in March. So let me, just
well,
a
ma'am,
second.
let
You're
me ask
asking
you-
me, so let me go back. August, September, October, November, December, January, February, March. He would have been involved with Lisa Andrews at that time.
So he was involved with Lisa Andrews. And you don't know whether or not they were involved in any, he was involved in any sexual activity with Miss Andrews at that time, correct?
I know that Miss Andrews wrote
Yes or no?
Miss Andrews wrote something talking about them
But
making
you
out
don't
too
know the
much.
date, do you?
There's a date on the journal. I'm not specific on the date, so I don't know, but he was involved with Miss Andrews at that time. So if she was the woman on the couch, there was something sexual. If she wasn't the woman on the couch, he was involved with her and involved with somebody else that he was being sexual with.
And that to you, even though he is no longer with Miss Arias because there's been this breakup, that to you is something you take into account, right? Yes or no?
I take into account.
Yes or no?
Yes, I take it into account.
And now, ma'am, with regard to Lisa Andrews, one of the things that you indicated to us was that in that letter that she wrote, that she complained about Mr. Alexander's inappropriate sexual advances, correct?
Yes.
In fact, though, do you know that Miss Andrews came in here and testified? Do you know about that?
Yes, I do.
And do you know that she actually said that she was the one that actually took the improper advances towards Mr. Alexander and that he refused them? Did you know that?
Objection, this characterizes Ms. Andrews' testimony.
Approach, please. You may continue.
You don't know whether or not it was whether or not it was Miss Andrews who initiated the intimacy with Mr. Alexander, do you?
No, I don't.
So when you look at the document, you're really basing it on something that is incomplete, right?
I'm basing it on what Miss Andrews says.
No, you're basing it on what was written in a document, correct?
Correct.
You weren't here when she testified, correct?
I was not here when she testified.
And you didn't go out and interview her, correct?
No, I didn't. I read 3 interviews by her, or more than 3.
But you didn't go out and talk to her yourself, correct?
I did not.
Now, and this issue involving the looking in the window happened in August of 2007, correct?
Correct.
And nothing is written here in this August 26th of 2007 journal entry, exhibit number 510, about that particular incident where the defendant came over and looked in the window, correct?
Correct.
And ma'am, as you understand it then, the defendant then came over the next day and spoke to Mr. Alexander about this particular event that she had seen, correct?
Correct.
And again, doesn't that seem like stalking behavior to you, that they are broken up as of June or July of 2007, that she moves to Mesa, Arizona near him, and then comes over to his house unannounced at night, sees what she sees, and then confronts him? That does not appear to you to be stalking behavior?
Not when I look at everything else.
Okay, so it does not appear to be stalking behavior. But it does, at that point, after she sees him with another woman engaged in this intimate contact is when the stories start about whether or not he is abused.
Objection as to stories.
Overruled.
The stories start about whether or not he has abused her physically, right? It was immediately thereafter, right?
It was in October.
So you believe that the physical contact between, the alleged physical contact between Mr. Alexander and the defendant occurred in October of 2007.
Yes.
What was the initiating or the first incident that you remember where he, according to you, physically touched her in a violent sort of way?
In October of 2007.
Describe the incident for me,
It
please.
was an incident where they were arguing. He grabbed her by the shoulders, threw her to the ground, and then told her she wasn't leaving.
Where were they?
They were, I'm not sure where they were. They were at her house or his house, I'm not sure.
And was she able to leave after he grabbed her?
She stayed.
Well, this is based on everything you tell us is what either somebody said or what you read, correct? 'Cause you read
Correct.
that. So, was she able to leave?
She said she couldn't leave at first, but then she admitted that she thought she would be able to leave. She didn't attempt to leave, but she thought she would be able to leave. And they commenced talking for 3 hours or so.
And ma'am, again, this behavior that we're talking about that you just described occurred after the end of August 26 of 07, after she sees him, by her own admission, with another woman, right?
Correct.
And then there's this physical altercation. There are no reports of it, correct?
Correct.
There are no other individuals that you know of that she has told about it, correct?
Correct.
There is no medical care that may have been needed, correct?
Correct.
And in fact, there is no journal entry indicating that either, is there?
No, and that would make sense.
It makes sense because you are biased in this case, aren't you, in favor of the defendant?
Objection argumentative.
Overruled. It makes sense because of all the years I've worked with battered women who do the same thing, Mr. Martinez.
So just because somebody else in a different state may have done something in a situation that may be similar, you have taken that and said, because of what this woman or this other woman may have done, you are then saying, that's the reason why I'm going to believe the defendant.
No, it isn't. It's because of everything that I've read, the consistency of what I've read, the timeline of what I've read, the behavior of Mr. Alexander, that, by the way, any man in my group would consider verbally abusive.
So
That's why I consider it.
So now what you're telling us is that because you counsel men, right? That's what you're telling us, right?
I counsel men and women.
Right. You counsel men, correct?
Yes, I do.
And now you're telling us, well, I looked at what these men think about in terms of abuse, and they say that what Mr. Alexander is doing is abusive, right? That's what you just told us, right?
I didn't tell them what Mr. Alexander did, but when they discuss abuse and they discuss the things they say to their partners, they talk about abuse.
Ma'am, you just told us just now every man in my group would consider what Mr. Alexander did abusive. You just told us that, right?
Correct.
You don't know what every one of those men would think, do you? You really can't say that, can you?
I know what they talk about in group, Mr.
You know what they-
Martinez.
You know what they talk about in group, but you don't know what they would think in this case. Can you at least admit that?
Objection argumentative.
Sustained.
Can you admit that or not?
Same question.
Can I admit that I don't know?
How they would decide this case in terms of whether or not Mr. Alexander was abusive.
Objection relevance.
Overruled. I believe that they would agree to that because I have heard their discussions. Some of them have been in the program over 2 years, and I know the way they look at abuse and the way they define abuse.
And this is one of the cornerstones of how you approach this case. how these men would look at this evidence, right?
No, it is not.
Well, you just told us that that's something that you are considering in looking at Mr. Alexander's behavior, what some guy out in Long Beach, California would think about, right?
Objection,
No.
Mr. Arias, your testimony.
Overruled.
No, I did not use that as a cornerstone, Mr. Martinez, at all, about what I just mentioned that now, but it's not something that I took in and said, gee, what would the man in my program think about what was being said? I looked at what was being said. I thought anyone who looked at what was being said, if they had a daughter and that was being said to their daughter, would be so upset and so wanting to change the behavior that was directed at someone they loved, male or female, that those words strung together are horrific words.
And ma'am, with regard to that, that's assuming the truth of what you are being told, right?
It's the,
Yes or no?
that's the instant message, Mr.
Right. Yeah, and
Mr. Martinez?
In fact, ma'am, there's nothing written in October about what this physical incident was, is there?
I was not addressing that.
I am.
Okay.
Isn't it true that these journals don't address this physical incident in October of 2007? That's where we started talking about this.
Right.
So now, with regard to these questions, in terms of the behavior that was exhibited by the defendant on August 26th or thereabouts of 2007, what would your men think of a woman coming over that they are broken up about, that they've broken up with, and they're with somebody else, and the previous girlfriend has moved over to where they live, has come over unannounced? Would those men think that that's stalking behavior, since you're using them as sort of a guide now?
Actually, they look at context, Mr. Martinez.
Speculation.
Ma'am, then after this incident in October of 2007, when is the next incident that you know of any physical aggressive behavior by Mr. Alexander?
In January of 2008.
And when was that, ma'am?
The end of January, the 21st, the 22nd.
So January 22nd of 2008, correct?
Well, 21st and 22nd, there were...
Okay. And ma'am, are you aware that in the early part of January of 2008, Mr. Alexander, per the testimony of Daniel Freeman, told the defendant, you need to move away, you need to get away from me? Are you aware of that?
Objection, mischaracterizes Mr. Freeman's testimony.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are directed to recall the testimony you heard in this trial. You may continue.
Are you aware of Mr. Alexander indicating to Mr. Freeman that he needed her to leave him?
I'm unaware of any testimony. I was not privy to testimony of prior witnesses.
So, did you read it anywhere, this statement by Mr. Freeman about Mr. Alexander's desire in January of 2008 that the defendant leave?
I don't recall, but I would be happy to look at that. If you have that interview, I'd be happy to look at it.
Ma'am, it was testimony here in court under oath.
Well, I'm not
So,
privy to that.
Assuming that's true, assuming that Mr. Freeman indicated under oath that in the early part of January 2008, Mr. Alexander indicated that he needed to have the talk with the defendant about her leaving.
Objection, mischaracterizes Mr. Freeman's testimony.
Overruled. Again, the jury is directed to recall the testimony they heard during this trial. You may continue.
Assuming that, thereafter is when this allegation involving the pedophilia arises on January 21 of 2008, right?
Yes.
And ma'am, one of the things that can be called stalking is to make up a lie about somebody and threaten them with exposure of that lie, isn't it? Isn't that stalking behavior?
I'm not sure what you're saying.
Exposing a nasty, horrific rumor that is untrue about an individual, that's also considered stalking behavior, correct?
I would consider that blackmailing behavior.
It's not stalking behavior by saying to somebody, I'm going to disclose something that's untrue.
I have no reason to believe that happened.
I'm not asking you to speculate as to whether or not it's happening. I'm talking about stalking. We're still talking about stalking under exhibit number 558.
Stalking behavior creates fear, but there's also behavior, generally speaking, along the way that people do because they're afraid of the stalker. So they don't continue to email them, they don't continue to see them, they don't continue to do those things. Stalkers frighten people, and when people are stalked, they generally try to get help. They get restraining orders, they call the police. There are numerous things people do if they believe they're being stalked, and you're telling me he believes he's being stalked from 2007, and I just don't see behavior that supports somebody being terrorized by a stalker.
And you're saying that they undertake behaviors in response to the stalking, correct? Yes or no?
Yes.
And telling the defendant to leave him alone and move back to Wairika, that would be one of the behaviors in response to stalking, correct?
It doesn't indicate fear behavior. It indicates that he has the power to tell her to go and expect that she will.
But that's a behavior that indicates a response to the stalking, doesn't it? Get away from me is a response to stalking, isn't it?
Objection is characterized as a testimony.
Overruled. You may answer the question asked.
I don't have reason to see that they're stalking, Mr. Martinez.
Okay, you don't see stalking there, and the response to it, whether it's get away...
Telling somebody to get away, sure.
All right.
Telling somebody to get away, I just don't see stalking behavior, so I'm trying to...
We've talked about some behaviors on the part of the defendant so far, haven't we?
Yes.
And you don't see any pattern there, correct? That's what you're saying.
I'm saying I don't see a pattern because of the other pattern of communication with Jodi Arias that Mr. Alexander continues to communicate. And in fact, the beginning of 2008 says, and starts the year by saying, I love you, Jodi, exclamation point. That's not behavior I see associated with stalking. I just don't.
And you say that he starts the year by saying, I love you, but we also have him saying, leave me alone in the first part of January 2008, don't we?
Objection is characterized as Mr. Freeman's testimony.
Overruled. The jury is directed to recall the testimony from the trial.
It has been reversed.
You may. Please be back in the designated area in 10 minutes. We will start promptly at that time. Please remember the admonition.